Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Panda Bear titled Panda Bear Meets the Grim Reaper. Now, one of the topics I've discussed fairly often in relationship to indie pop is something called regression to childhood, which in the simplest of possible terms is the tendency of some indie artists to revert back to childlike states in their music in order to bring out a more emotionally authentic and real experience, at least for them. Now, I'll admit right at the gate that I'm not exactly a fan of this. I'm a fan of more experienced, mature songwriting and storytelling, but there are cases where this sort of thing can kind of work. After all, there's been some great emo, pop punk, and indie pop records that have come from this mindset. And capturing that childlike wonder at the larger world around you, it's something potent in and of its own right. That's a real powerful emotion. Hell, it was one of the thematic undercurrents that made Swan's most recent record, To Be Kind, so powerful and emotionally evocative for me, at least thematically. Now, that being said, if we're looking for an act that pushes this regression to its absolute limit, you gotta look at Animal Collective. And to be honest, I've got a very complicated relationship with this band, where at best I can say that they're hit and miss. On the one hand, they can occasionally tap into a sound that's evocative and powerful and unlike anything else, but on the other hand, it can sometimes feel like they're throwing shit at the walls and seeing what will actually manage to stick. Now, from that point of view, I've often found myself a lot more interested in Panda Bear, the stage name for Noah Lennox, and who has consistently proven himself to be a slightly more grounded presence, or at least one that's more willing to embrace some traditional song structures at least. He's at least more consistent than the rest of Animal Collective, or as the band as a whole, and as such, he made his name with the 2007 critically beloved album Person Pitch. And don't get me wrong, that's a great album, but it's also one that convinced me that he might be a better writer of succinct, tighter pop music in the vein of, say, Brian Wilson, than the overblown, grand attempts that really can't sustain much of their length. Believe it or not, despite the fact that his 2011 follow-up Tomboy might not hit as many transcendent moments, I actually consider it a tighter, more cohesive, and better album, especially when it comes to its themes. Now, it was also an album that showed that Panda Bear was going darker, and when I heard the title of this record, Panda Bear Meets the Grim Reaper, I expected that trend was probably gonna continue here. So, what do we get? Well, honestly, I feel underwhelmed by this album. And the funny thing is, I didn't really have any expectations going into it, outside of the assumptions, well, that it would probably be darker given the themes and its title. And yeah, it is, but the more I listened through this album, the more I got the impression that Noah Lennox, he could have done more with this album. And while there are fragments and moments of these tracks that I do like, and the overall sound of the album as a whole is appealing, as a whole the record feels just a little bit shapeless and could have used a little bit more definition to really drive it home, at least for me. So okay, let's start with the instrumentation and the production. And by now, if you're familiar with Panda Bear's sound, you know exactly what you're going to be getting here. Washed out, organic textures that feel imported from the late 60s, slightly off-kilter yet very accessible melodies, layered vocal leads with a little bit too much reverb, or a lot too much reverb depending on the song, slightly eerie samples or moments with a bit more grime and edge, more in this album than some of the others, which is definitely welcome in my opinion, some decent grooves or interesting percussion progressions, and a taste for repetition that's both a blessing and a curse. Because let's be honest here, Panda Bear's material tends to rely on establishing that solid vibe and coasting, either through grooves or really good melodies. And there are moments where that vibe really does hold up here. The oscillating grind of Mr. Noah, the wobbling piano groove of Crosswords, the wet glistening sound of Butcher, Baker, Candlestick Maker, the fluttering arpeggios of Tropic of Cancer, the excellent contrast between the pianos and the harsher synth effects on Lonely Wanderer, and best of all, those sharply defined, scratchy synth groove on Selfish Gene that almost reminds me of mid to late period Depeche Mode. But here's the tricky thing about dropping into these vibes. If you don't modulate or evolve your grooves and melodies within the song, it can make them start to feel, well, a little bit repetitive. And while Panda Bear has had a knack for these subtle manipulations before, on this album the shifts are either too subtle or buried to really spot and make out, or the songs don't simply evolve in the same way. And that's before we get to the songs where instead of evolving, the tracks just end unexpectedly, almost feeling a little bit too short and abortive, something I never expected I'd say about a Panda Bear song. And it gets even stranger when you talk about the vocals. And look, Noah Lennox, he's a fine vocalist. I get the appeal of the layered multi-part harmonies and the rounds that he creates on this album. I just wish he didn't feel the need to pile on the reverb as much as he does. This is an issue that I've had with Panda Bear for a long time now, and it's apparent here. And look, it's a tricky balance between the grim tone you need for some of the darker themes with the hollowness of the reverb, and letting some real raw emotional power run through the vocal delivery. And more often than not, Panda Bear's choice for heavier reverb on this album does mute some of that raw impact, on top of making his lyrics a lot harder to parse out, which really doesn't help matters. So okay, let's talk about these lyrics, shall we? For as much as the title implies a meeting with death, Panda Bear is not going that dark by intimately making contact with the Grim Reaper himself. Instead, he's writing about the deaths of those who are close to him, or the slow realization that he himself is growing older and advancing in time. In both cases, he's building in a degree of separation between himself and death, either through time or through other people, which makes sense. Death itself is hard to confront, but it also does a lot of the same for the audience, including me, which can make it a little bit tougher to connect with the sentiments behind Panda Bear's writing, which, as always, is repetitious, a little overly simplistic, and at several points revealing of some really unflattering moments and thoughts from him. But you know what? All that being said, there are moments that get close to really having some real emotional poignance for me. The implied death of a dog that plays out in the first half of the album, and where he gets very personal on Tropic of Cancer and the very solid Lonely Wanderer as he tries to reconcile with himself his father's death. But Lennox himself said that he tried to keep the lyrics as non-specific and relatable as possible, trying to tap into that broad sense of populism. And you know what? That's probably the biggest problem with this album, considering how much of it locks into distinctive, almost static vibes that don't really hit potent crescendos, making the lyrics such broadly sketched, it neuters their emotional punch even further. And while I get that Panda Bear was trying to keep this album fairly lightweight, he's not going for heavy and deep and emotional here. He's only trying to reveal his insecurities at the passage of time in the details at best, a veil of confidence to hide his unease as he continues his arc from tomboy and continues to embrace more change. The darker moments here, they don't really crystallize beyond some mild regret in the vein of you don't really know what you have until it's gone. And sure, it's a fine sentiment to build an album around, and there are points where it plays out well, but it just feels underdeveloped here in the writing, spread so thin that it boils down to a lot of vague platitudes. There is some curdled anger to be sure, but it never really explodes or grows out, and thus the somewhat triumphant feel of the final track, Acid Watch, really does ring hollow for me, especially lyrically. It doesn't feel earned. So you know what, in the end, look, maybe this album just isn't for me. I've never been a huge Animal Collective or Panda Bear fan as it is, but even on that standard, I'm not sure that Panda Bear Meets the Grim Reaper is as strong as it could have been. It never really lands that personal punch lyrically and feels a little bit too static instrumentally, creates a solid vibe, and then it just pretty much coasts there, never goes above and beyond. And sure, some of you could argue that was its intention, but Noah Lennox has built tighter, more cohesive records than this. I'm not sure this album rises to the heights that Person Pitch or Tomboy did. Now, that being said, I can't exactly say that I disliked this album either, or that any one song in this record was outright bad, just kind of forgettable at worst, which for me was enough to elevate this album to a pretty strong 6 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation, especially if you're an Animal Collective or Panda Bear fan. Otherwise, if you can dig the vibe, it's worth a listen. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I've been away for a couple days. I've actually been really recovering from being sick pretty badly over the past 3 or 4 days. It's been hell. So yeah, apologies if my voice is a little bit scratchy or off tune. So yeah, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. I'm trying to get through my schedule as fast as I can. Don't worry, some of the big ones are coming. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.